name is Jonathan Hayes, and though my hair has turned silver and my bones creak louder than the floorboards of my old farmhouse, I still carry the weight of a life built with sweat and sacrifice. The kind of life men of my generation were taught to honor with pride. Yet as I sit down to tell you this story, I confess that pride has turned bitter on my tongue, for it has brought me nothing but betrayal and a courtroom filled with whispers of my downfall. I was born the son of a steelworker, raised in a town where men shook hands harder than they spoke words, where we believed in work, God, and family, always in that order, and I carried those values like commandments carved into my chest, serving this country in uniform, breaking my back for decades on the railroad, never once stealing or cheating, never once turning away a man in need. But all of it, every drop of sweat, every bone I nearly broke, every prayer whispered in the quiet of my room, came to mean nothing on the day I stepped into that courthouse, because sitting across from me, staring with eyes that once looked to me for guidance, was my son Michael, no longer the boy who chased fireflies in the summer dusk or built wooden forts with me in the backyard, but a polished man in a dark blue suit, his hands folded neatly on the table like a stranger who had come not to seek reconciliation, but to bury me alive under the weight of his lies. And though the jury looked at him with sympathy, their eyes slid over me as if I were the villain, as if I had sinned against the very blood that ran through my veins. And I cannot begin this tale without first telling you the kind of father I was. Stern, yes, because life had been stern with me. Quiet, yes, because the world never gave men like me the luxury of softness. But I was there, always there, through every broken bone he suffered on the football field, through every fevered night when he cried as a child, through every exam he failed when he thought he wasn't enough. I was there, reminding him that he was my son, that he carried my name, that he was meant for something greater than his doubts. Yet as I sat on that wooden bench in the courtroom, hearing his lawyer twist stories into weapons, I realized that perhaps in all my teachings, in all my efforts to make him strong, I had unknowingly forged something else in him, a hunger sharper than love, a greed more enduring than loyalty, and a heart that had learned not to forgive but to conquer, even if the one to be conquered was the very man who gave him life. I remember the moment the judge called my name to the stand, the weight of that single syllable, Hayes, echoing in the room like a verdict before a verdict. And as I rose, my knees stiff from years of labor, I felt every eye shift from my son to me, like the crowd had been waiting for a monster to reveal himself, like they expected me to stumble, to confess to sins I had never committed. And I wondered how we had come to this place, how the boy whose hand I once held as we crossed busy streets could now sit there, lips pressed into a line of cold defiance, his gaze fixed on me as though I were nothing more than a debtor, refusing to pay my dues. I cleared my throat, my voice gravelly with age, and began to tell my truth. But the words felt heavy, not because I lacked honesty, but because I could feel them slipping past the jury's ears as though they had already chosen sides, as though my gray hair and calloused hands were proof enough of guilt. I spoke of the house I built with my own 2 hands, of the nights I worked double shifts so Michael could attend the university he dreamed of the birthday gifts I wrapped with trembling fingers, even when money was scarce, of the sacrifices no ledger could ever record, but his lawyer, slick young, and trained in the art of twisting love into liability, objected at every turn, painting me as a tyrant who ruled with iron rather than affection, as a miser who hoarded rather than provided, as a man who demanded obedience rather than offered guidance, and every word felt like a knife carving away the flesh of the father I had been, until what remained was a shadow, a villain sketched by the hands of strangers. And still, through it all, Michael did not flinch, did not break, did not look away. He sat there as if carved from stone, his jaw tight, his eyes unblinking. And for the first time since the day he was born, I saw no trace of my son in him, only a stranger who had taken my blood and turned it into a weapon. And I knew then that whatever this trial was about in the eyes of the law, money, inheritance, property, at its core, it was something deeper, something far more brutal. It was my son's judgment upon me, and though no gavel had yet fallen, I could already feel the chains of betrayal tightening around my wrists. As I sat there under the harsh light of that courtroom, my mind betrayed me, drifting backward into memories I had buried, and for the first time I wondered if the roots of this betrayal had been planted long ago, in the cracks I had ignored, when Michael was still just a boy. I remembered the nights he would slam his bedroom door, the muffled sobs that seeped through the thin walls after his mother left us, and how I told myself he just needed time, that silence was easier than confrontation, but maybe what he needed was a father who could bend, who could kneel beside him and admit he too was broken. I remembered the first time I caught him lying. He was only 11, his hands sticky with candy he had stolen from the corner shop, his eyes wide with guilt. But instead of teaching him about remorse, I scolded him so harshly that he didn't speak to me for days, and though I told myself it was discipline, I see now it was distance I was creating brick by brick, wall by wall. I remembered the report cards filled with praise from teachers, notes that said brilliant but withdrawn, and how I only praised the grades, ignoring the loneliness behind them, because I believed that achievement was love enough. And maybe, in my blindness, I failed to see the storm gathering in him, a storm that would one day break and sweep me away with it. And then I thought of the day he turned 18, standing tall in his cap and gown, his eyes shining not with pride but with something sharper, something cold. And when he shook my hand instead of embracing me, the audience clapped as though they were cheering for a triumph. But inside me there was a quiet grief, a knowing that my son was already leaving me behind, that the bond we once shared had already begun to rot. And now, years later, here we were sitting on opposite sides of a battlefield. Neither of us had chosen outright, but both of us had been marching toward for decades, blind to the fact that every silence, every unspoken apology, every hardened word had been leading us to this single merciless collision. The first time Michael openly defied me still burns in my memory like a wound that never closes. It was a family dinner, one of those rare nights when I tried to bring some warmth back into the house, inviting my sister and her children over, laying the table with more food than we could finish, thinking maybe laughter could patch the cracks in our family. But as soon as I began to speak about responsibility, about how Michael needed to think of his future and consider the path I had walked before him, he snapped, not with words of teenage rebellion, but with a cold, cutting voice that silenced the entire table, saying, "Your path is nothing but failure, and I won't waste my life living like you." I remember the clatter of a dropped fork, my sister's sharp intake of breath, the children staring wide-eyed, and me frozen as though I had been slapped in front of the world. I wanted to shout, to demand respect, to remind him of every sacrifice I had made to keep food on that very table. But instead I sat there, my heart heavy, my mouth dry, and the only thing I managed to say was his name. Michael, soft, pleading, almost broken, but he didn't flinch, didn't waver. He just looked back at me with that same coldness, like I was no longer a father but a stranger intruding in his life. And in that moment, I felt something inside me collapse, something fragile that had held me together all these years. I knew then that this wasn't just rebellion. This was the start of a war not fought with fists but with silence, contempt, and a growing distance that no amount of effort could bridge. And from that night on, I noticed how he avoided me, how he made decisions without asking, how he carried himself with a quiet defiance as though he had already exiled me from his heart, leaving me only with the ghost of. Began to see the shadows that trailed behind Michael, not just the shadows of adolescence but the darker ones that came with the company he kept, boys with restless eyes and cruel laughter, men older than him who whispered promises of fast money, quick power and easy respect, things I could never give him no matter how hard I worked, no matter how many nights I came home with calloused hands and an aching back. I noticed how his clothes changed, sharp jackets that didn't fit the boy I once knew, shoes that gleamed but carried him further from home, and a phone always buzzing with voices I didn't recognize, voices that filled him with a confidence that felt unnatural, borrowed, dangerous. I tried to talk to him, God knows I tried, sitting by his door late at night telling him stories of when I was young, when I too had been tempted by shortcuts, by the illusion of respect, by friends who vanished the moment life grew hard. But he would cut me off with a laugh, shaking his head, saying, "That's your story, Dad, not mine. I'm not you." And it hurt more than I can put into words because I wasn't trying to make him me. I was trying to save him from becoming the worst version of himself, from losing the very things that made him Michael, my son, my blood. Every time I reached out, he seemed to step further away, like I was the one dragging him down, like the weight of my love was something he couldn't carry anymore. And in those moments I started to wonder if love was enough, if sacrifice was enough, if being a father meant watching your child walk into fire while your hands were tied, powerless to pull him back. The house grew colder, quieter, as if his absence even when present drained the warmth from the walls, and I found myself staring at old photographs, his first steps, his first day at school, his smile missing a tooth, wondering how the boy in those pictures could have become the stranger who barely looked me in the eye. The first real crack in the fragile glass of our lives came one evening when the police knocked on my door. Their faces carried that practiced mix of sternness and pity, the kind that told me they had been here before with other fathers, other sons, and I felt the world tilt as they asked if I knew where Michael was, saying his name like it was already stained, like it belonged on some report instead of my heart. Apparently, he and his friends had been caught near a warehouse where stolen goods were being moved, and though they couldn't pin anything solid on him that night, the implication was clear. He was circling the edge of something that would swallow him whole if he didn't step back. I remember standing there in the doorway nodding, promising to keep an eye on him, my stomach burning with shame and fear, while Michael appeared behind me, calm as stone, smirking at the officers as if the whole thing were a game, as if my trembling hands and sleepless eyes were nothing more than an inconvenience. That night I tried again to reach him, to shake him awake with words, with anger, even with tears, telling him that every choice he made now would carve the shape of his future, that the men he thought were his friends would abandon him. A moment the walls closed in, but he just looked at me with that chilling indifference, his voice flat as he said, "You don't get it, Dad. The world isn't about hard work anymore. It's about power, and I'm done being powerless." Those words cut deeper than any blade, because they told me that he had already chosen a path, one I couldn't walk with him, one I couldn't pull him from unless I broke something inside myself. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the silent phone, half praying for it to ring, half dreading that it would, imagining all the ways the world could steal my son from me, bars, bullets, or worse, the slow death of a soul that forgets where it came from. The next few weeks dragged like chains tied to my ankles, each day bringing whispers, glances from neighbors, and late-night phone calls that jolted me upright in bed, heart racing, only to find silence on the other end. It was as if the world itself knew something I didn't and was mocking me with fragments I couldn't piece together. One evening, while walking home from the factory, I saw Michael across the street, not alone but surrounded by men much older than him, hard-faced, heavy-set men with eyes that measured everything and trusted nothing. They stood outside a bar, whose windows glowed red against the night, their voices low, their laughter sharp like broken glass. And in the middle of them, my boy stood tall, his shoulders squared, his face carved into a mask that was not his own. A stranger's mask. I froze in the shadows, unable to move, listening as one of them clapped him on the back, praising him for something, while another handed him an envelope thick enough to choke me with dread. My first instinct was to rush across, to drag him away, to shout his name until the child I raised remembered me. But fear held me in place, the fear of what those men might do to him if I exposed him, or to me if I interfered. I walked home that night with fire in my chest and ash in my mouth, waiting for him to return, rehearsing what I would say, how I would beg or command or plead. But when he finally came through the door, his eyes caught mine with a cool defiance, the kind of look a wolf gives a shepherd when it no longer fears the staff. I asked him softly at first where he had been, who those men were, what was in the envelope. He laughed, not the boyish laugh I once knew, but a bitter, hollow sound that told me he had crossed a threshold I could never follow. "You wouldn't understand, Dad," he said, stuffing the envelope deep into his jacket pocket. "This is survival. This is respect. This is more than your life of scraps and sweat could ever give me." His words crushed me like stones because I realized in that moment he wasn't just drifting. He was running headlong into the storm, and no amount of love, no memory of who he once was, could stop him unless I did something that might cost us both everything. I spent that night wide awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind a storm of fear, guilt, and anger, replaying every moment I had thought I knew my son, Michael. The boy who once clutched my hand on rainy streets. The boy who had drawn his first crooked house in crayon and laughed at my terrible attempts to read his words. And now he had become someone I did not recognize. Someone whose voice carried the weight of secrets I was too terrified to uncover. Someone whose footsteps echoed like threats in the silent halls of my home. I could see it all clearly in the mirror that morning. My own gray-streaked hair, the deep lines carved by decades of worry and labor, the hands that had built a life only to watch it crumble in silence. And I realized that my helplessness had become a cage around both of us. I thought about confronting him directly, about storming into that dimly lit bar and demanding answers from the men who had pulled him into their world. But I knew that I was too old, too weak, too measured by years of caution to face them unarmed. Yet the alternative, sitting at home while my son continued down this dangerous path, was unbearable, a slow death of the heart that no medicine could cure. I considered calling the police, but a voice inside me whispered that they would not understand, that their law could not untangle the tangled webs of loyalty, fear, and desperation that Michael had woven around himself, and that each intervention risked pushing him further from me. By midday, I decided I would follow him, not openly but silently from shadows and across streets, watching his every move, learning the rules of the world he had chosen so that when the moment came, I could step in and save him before it was too late. And as I trailed him that afternoon, hiding behind fences and parked cars, I saw a side of him that chilled my soul. He was negotiating with men who dealt in things that belonged in nightmares, things that could ruin a life with a signature, a nod, a silent agreement. And yet he held himself with confidence, speaking words I did not understand, signing papers I did not see, shaking hands that could destroy him with a single decision. And in that moment I felt my heart splinter because he was no longer my son. Or perhaps he was. But the boy I knew had been buried under layers of fear, ambition, and necessity, leaving only this new figure, dangerous, brilliant, and terrifyingly adult. That night, I returned home alone, stomach knotted, hands trembling, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the envelope he had left behind on the counter, a thick bundle of paper that smelled faintly of tobacco and ink. And I realized it held more than money or contracts. It held a statement of his independence, a declaration that he had stepped outside the world I had created for him and would answer only to his own rules. And I wept for hours, not out of anger, not entirely, out of fear, but out of the profound grief of watching a life I had nurtured and loved slip into shadows I could not follow. Yet knowing deep in my bones that I had to try, that I had no choice but to become the man I had never thought I could be, the protector, the guardian, the father who would walk through fire, break laws, defy the world if necessary, just to bring back the boy I had once held. The boy whose laughter once made every hardship seem small. The boy whose betrayal now demanded a courage I did not know I possessed. Because sometimes love is not gentle. Sometimes it is violent, relentless, and unforgiving. And if I failed, I would not only lose him forever, I would lose myself. And that was a price too terrible to imagine paying. The next morning I woke before dawn, Michael's absence pressing down on me like a weight I could not lift, and I knew I could not wait another second for clarity or courage to arrive naturally. I had to force it out of myself, draw it like fire from a cold stone, because every minute he spent in that world of shadows and whispered deals was another minute closer to danger, another step away from the boy I had once known. I packed a small bag with essentials, careful not to alert my wife that I was leaving before she woke, because I could feel the tension already thickening in her chest. She loved Michael, yes, but she did not understand the stakes, could not see the labyrinth of threats, alliances, and debts that had become his life. As I drove through streets still draped in morning fog, I replayed every lesson I had ever taught him, every warning I had whispered, every embrace I had given in hopes of shaping his path, and the bitter irony twisted inside me. All of it had failed, and yet all of it had prepared me for this moment, this desperate march into the unknown where my courage, my intelligence, and my love would be tested against forces I had never imagined confronting. I trailed him from a distance, keeping my eyes sharp and my heart sharper, watching him meet men with cold eyes and sharper intentions, listening to words meant for ears that did not belong to me, but piecing together enough to understand the stakes, the debts, and the dangerous liaisons that could ruin him in an instant. Each time he looked over his shoulder, my breath caught, fearing he might see me, fear me, reject me. Yet I kept moving, keeping shadows between us, knowing that my patience was as crucial as my determination, because one wrong step, one confrontation, could shatter the fragile tether that still connected us. By midday, I followed him into a narrow alley where a deal was set to conclude, my hands trembling not with fear of him, but of the world he had stepped into. The men whose smiles were knives, the air thick with the unspoken threats of those who measured power and dominance in silence, and I realized that in that alley, under the glaring sun and the cold eyes of strangers, I would have to step forward, not as a father pleading, not as a man begging for mercy, but as a force he could not ignore, a presence that could reshape the outcome of the day, because if I failed now, the boy I had once held in my arms would vanish into the currents of a life I could not follow, and that loss would be permanent, unforgiving, and absolute, leaving only memories and regret in the hollow chambers of my heart where love should have remained. And so I took a slow breath, adjusted my collar, and prepared to step into the light, knowing that nothing in my years of careful living had prepared me for this confrontation. And yet everything I had ever done, the patience, the mistakes, the sacrifices, the nights of endless worry, had led to this single, inevitable moment, where fatherhood demanded more than words, more than protection, more than hope. It demanded action, precision, courage, and a willingness to risk everything to reclaim what had been lost. As I stepped into the alley, the heat of the day pressed down on me like a warning, the narrow walls of brick and graffiti closing in, every footstep echoing too loudly. But I forced myself to move with deliberate calm, every instinct screaming at me to retreat, to hide, to let someone else bear the burden of what was coming. Yet I could not, would not, because Michael, my son, was there, tangled in a web of debts and dangerous promises, his eyes sharp and wary, scanning every shadow, every corner, every figure that lurked with hands tucked in pockets or resting on the hilt of what might be a weapon. And I realized with a cold clarity that I was entering a battlefield not of my making, yet entirely my responsibility. The men he had been meeting were older, their smiles thin and predatory, their suits pressed as if to announce power before a word was spoken, and I could see immediately that they underestimated him, underestimated me, underestimated the quiet, simmering force of a father who had lost everything and learned that survival and redemption required audacity, cunning, and the readiness to strike at the precise moment. I slowed, letting my presence become part of the shadows, studying every detail, the way the sunlight reflected off a gold watch, the slight twitch in a hand, the nervous glance at a phone hidden in a jacket pocket, and pieced together the hierarchy of control in the alley, realizing that to intervene without caution would be to risk everything, Michael's life, my own, and the fragile tether of trust that still bound us. Yet I could not wait for caution alone, for the web was tightening and the young men with Michael were growing anxious, their energy sharp, unpredictable, dangerous, and I felt a surge of something older than fear, older than despair, a fire of resolve, honed over decades of sacrifice, betrayal, and heartbreak, because I understood that this confrontation, messy and dangerous as it was the only path left to reclaim my son from the world that threatened to devour him. And so I stepped fully into the alley, hands visible but calm, voice steady yet low, and called his name, Michael, letting it cut through the tension like a blade through fog. And in that moment, I saw him freeze, recognition flashing in his eyes mingled with confusion and relief, and I knew that the battle had begun not with violence, but with presence, with the undeniable weight of a father who would not yield, who would not allow the forces of greed, fear, and manipulation to claim the boy he had raised, the boy who had once laughed in the backyard, trusted his father with secrets and dreams. And I braced myself, ready to navigate the delicate dance of power, negotiation, and paternal authority. That would determine whether he returned to me or was lost forever to the dark currents that threatened to sweep him away. I could feel the tension coil around us like a live wire, the heat of the afternoon doing nothing to dull the sharp edge of fear and anticipation. And as Michael's gaze met mine, I saw the flicker of recognition deepen into something more complicated. Relief, but also guilt, and a silent plea for protection that pierced me sharper than any words could. The men surrounding him shifted, sensing the change in the air, and I could almost hear their thoughts. The unspoken calculations of dominance and intimidation, weighing the newcomer, me, against their carefully constructed control. Yet I did not flinch, did not step back, because every lesson life had carved into my bones screamed that hesitation here could cost more than money or pride. It could cost my son, the last tether to the life I had once thought secure. And so I advanced slowly, deliberately, measuring every step, every movement, projecting calm while inside my heart thundered, and Michael's hand brushed against mine. A fleeting contact, a fragile promise of alliance, and I felt a surge of clarity, a reminder that even in the darkest alleys, even amidst betrayal and danger, the bond between a father and son can outlast fear, deceit, and the forces of a world that seems designed to tear people apart. As I spoke his name again, low and steady, the words carrying weight not of threat but of protection, I could see the hesitation ripple through the men who had encircled him, the thin veneer of confidence cracking as they realized that this was not just another street confrontation. This was a reckoning, a collision of past sacrifices, pain endured, and the unyielding determination of a man who had lost everything yet refused to lose what mattered most. And in that moment, the alley seemed to expand and contract simultaneously. Each brick wall, each shadow, each scattered scrap of trash on the ground charged with significance, bearing witness to the silent war unfolding. A war not fought with guns or knives alone, but with presence, with unspoken history, with the sheer force of love, anger, and righteous fury. And as I moved closer to Michael, extending a hand that was both invitation and shield, I knew that whatever came next, the threats, the intimidation, the cunning maneuvers of men who thought they held all the power, would be met with the calculated patience of a father who had walked through fire, endured betrayal, and now stood ready to reclaim his son, to navigate the treacherous currents that surrounded us, and to ensure that no matter what darkness the world had planned for him, Michael would not face it alone. For I was there, fully present, unbroken, and more dangerous than they could ever imagine, carrying the weight of decades, the sting of injustices, and the unquenchable fire of a father's love that demanded both survival and triumph. The moment stretched, taut like a wire ready to snap, and I could see the subtle twitch in the shoulders of the men around Michael, the way their eyes darted between him and me, calculating, assessing, underestimating what they couldn't fully measure, the depth of desperation, the precision born from years of surviving betrayals, of watching friends and family turn their backs, of carrying wounds that never fully healed but sharpened instincts into something deadly. I took a deliberate step closer, my voice low but firm, reverberating with authority that surprised even me. And Michael flinched slightly but didn't pull away, his trust, fragile yet unbroken, anchoring me in that chaos, while the men shifted, uneasily, sensing that this was no ordinary street dispute, no petty fight, but a reckoning of layers they could not see, of history, of pain, of the silent warnings embedded in every movement I made. And as I glanced around, every shadow seemed to conspire with us, every flicker of light reflecting off cracked windows like some ghostly jury watching the unfolding scene. And I knew in that instant that if I faltered, even for a heartbeat, all the careful strategy, all the painstaking patience, all the nights spent replaying scenarios in my mind to prepare for exactly this moment, would collapse into chaos. So I steadied myself, controlled my breathing, allowed the simmering anger, the raw grief, the unrelenting resolve to flow through me in a measured wave, and as I reached Michael's side, brushing against him with the silent assurance of protection, I whispered his name like a vow, a promise that no matter how clever, how ruthless, how intimidating the men surrounding us might be, They had not accounted for the depth of a father's determination, for the way betrayal can forge a man into a force untouchable by fear, untamed by hesitation, and suddenly, in the briefest instant, I saw the leader of the group falter, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, a crack in the armor of confidence that had been his greatest weapon, and I seized it, my eyes locking with his, conveying a silent message that I had been through far worse, endured far more, and that my son, my only remaining tether to everything that once gave my life meaning, was not to be toyed with, not now, not ever. And as the seconds stretched, and the air thickened with anticipation, I realized that the alley, the shadows, the faint hum of distant traffic, all of it had become a stage for something far greater than a mere confrontation. It was a test of courage, of loyalty, of the raw, unshakable bond that binds a father to his son, and no matter what came next, the threats, the intimidation, the cunning strategies, they would soon learn that a man with nothing left to lose yet everything to protect is a force that bends the world to his will. And I, Robert, was standing in that alley, heart racing, bones aching, mind razor sharp, ready to show them exactly what that meant, and to ensure that Michael, my son, would emerge unscathed, not because the world cared, not because justice had favored him, but because I would not allow anything or anyone to take him from me. The alley seemed to shrink around us as I felt the weight of every second pressing down, every shadow bending toward the truth that I, Robert, would no longer be ignored, would no longer allow the same hands that once shook mine in false smiles, that once nodded with hollow sympathy while plotting in silence, to dictate the terms of our lives. Michael's grip on my arm tightened, a subtle reminder that he trusted me, that despite the fear that ran in his veins, he believed in the father who had endured the worst and emerged unbroken. And that belief became a conduit of power, an energy, that surged through me as if every betrayal, every slight, every night spent in silent anguish had been stored, and now returned tenfold in a pulse that I could not, and would not contain. And the men surrounding us shifted again, sensing the shift, the invisible line I had crossed, the subtle yet undeniable warning that came not from weapons or threats but from presence, from a history written in scars and sacrifices, and I stepped forward, deliberately slow, every motion a statement, every glance a declaration that the reckoning had arrived, and in that instant, I saw something in Michael's eyes that I had almost forgotten existed, a spark of defiance, a glimmer of hope, a flicker of the boy who had once believed the world was fair, and it struck me that even in the darkest moments, even when the system that was supposed to protect us had failed, even when the people who should have loved us had abandoned their roles, the bond between father and son could create its own. Justice could ignite its own fury, and the men closest to us hesitated, and I felt the power of that hesitation as if it were a tangible thing, a door left ajar in a fortress, a chance to reclaim everything that had been stolen. And I whispered to Michael, a low, deliberate tone carrying both reassurance and resolve, telling him to watch, to remember, to understand that courage is not the absence of fear but the choice to act despite it. And the leader, sensing the shift too late, made a subtle move, a twitch, a reach that could have ended everything in a heartbeat. But I was faster, guided by years of watching, of learning, of surviving the betrayal of blood and law, and with a calculated motion I blocked the move, sending a clear message that we were not prey, that we were a force. And in that split second I knew the moment had arrived where the world would have to recognize that Robert, a man stripped of everything yet unbowed, would not kneel, would not beg, would not retreat. And, as the tension thickened and the alley seemed to hold its breath, I realized that this confrontation was no longer about fear or control or intimidation. It was about legacy, about proving that when a father stands between his son and the world, there is no power, no cunning, no law that can hold him back. And that night, amid shadows and whispers of past betrayals, I vowed silently, fiercely, that whatever came next, however cunning, however ruthless, however unfair, the bond we shared, the fire that burned in both of us, would be the force that turned despair into triumph, pain into precision, and the reckoning that had been postponed for so long would finally arrive with the unstoppable momentum of truth, loyalty, and the unbreakable will of a father who had lost everything yet discovered a strength the world had never dared to challenge. The city lights flickered above us, but in that alley, the glow did nothing to penetrate the storm of memories and betrayals that churned inside me. Robert, as I felt the weight of decades pressing on my shoulders, the ghosts of promises broken, and loyalties abandoned whispering in my ear with cruel precision. And yet, despite the ache in my bones and the hollowness in my chest, I knew I could not falter, could not yield, because every step I had taken to survive the manipulations of those I trusted, every sleepless night spent plotting a way to reclaim what was stolen from me, every humiliation endured in the cold courts and whispered corridors of power, had led me to this moment where fear was irrelevant, where hesitation was his gaze. I realized that the lessons of a father are not taught in comfort, but in adversity, in standing firm when the world conspires against you. And I moved with deliberate purpose, each stride a declaration of intent, each glance a silent message to the men who had underestimated us, who had laughed behind closed doors at the notion that a broken man could still possess the strength to disrupt their schemes. And I saw it in their eyes, the flicker of doubt, the subtle hesitation, the instant where confidence wavered, and I pressed on, knowing that in that fragile moment power shifted, not through violence alone, but through the aura of unwavering resolve. And as the leader of the group stepped forward, his expression a mask of calculated dominance hiding the uncertainty beneath, I spoke, my voice low yet cutting through the tension like a blade, reminding them that every betrayal has a price, every injustice a reckoning, and though they had treated me as less than human, dismissed my sacrifices and mocked my pain, they had underestimated the ferocity born from loss, the intelligence forged in silence, and the unbreakable will that comes when a father refuses to let the world claim his child, his dignity, or his truth. And in that instant, as shadows danced on the wet cobblestones and the night air grew thick with anticipation, I felt the culmination of years of suffering, humiliation, and strategic patience coalesce into a single force that was both terrifying and undeniable. And I knew that this night, this confrontation would not be forgotten, that history would remember the moment when Robert, a man who had been stripped bare by life and betrayed by blood, chose to rise, to act, and to ensure that justice, long denied and manipulated, would finally bend toward the righteous, the relentless, and the unyielding. And with that knowledge burning in my chest, I prepared for the final moves, knowing that what came next would decide not just survival, but the legacy of defiance, courage, and the unwavering bond between a father and son who had endured the unendurable and refused to bow to the weight of the world. The alley seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with tension and the scent of rain-soaked asphalt, and I, Robert, felt the culmination of decades of pain, betrayal, and silent endurance converge into a single, undeniable force that surged through me, filling every fiber of my being with the raw power of a father who refuses to be broken, who refuses to surrender what is rightfully his. And as the men who had plotted, schemed, and mocked my downfall closed in, their confident strides betraying a hint of doubt they thought I could not see, I realized that true strength is not measured by muscle or wealth, but by resilience, by the capacity to rise again and again, by the fire that burns brighter in the face of injustice. And with Michael gripping my arm, his eyes wide with fear and hope, I stepped forward, letting the silence hang heavy between us like a living entity, until I spoke, my voice low, deliberate, carrying the weight of every insult, every humiliation, every moment where the world had deemed me defeated. You thought I was finished. You thought my loyalty, my love, my sacrifices meant nothing. But you underestimated what a father is willing to endure, and what he is capable of when pushed to the edge. And as my words fell, the men faltered, their confidence cracking as they sensed the storm they had awakened. And I saw it. The hesitation, the flicker of fear, the unspoken acknowledgement that they were facing not just a man, but a force shaped by decades of endurance. And with a steady hand, I revealed the evidence they never expected, the truth they tried to bury, the secrets that would dismantle their empire of lies. And in that instant, the power shifted irrevocably. as each revelation struck like a hammer on fragile armor, and I watched, with a sense of vindication so profound it almost overwhelmed me as those who had scorned me, mocked me and attempted to erase me from the narrative of their lives, stumbled, faltered, and finally recognized the reckoning they had long evaded. And in the center of that chaos I stood unbowed, unbroken and resolute, knowing that this night marked the apex of a journey forged through suffering, resilience, and unwavering paternal love. And as Michael reached out, grasping my hand with quiet admiration, I realized that victory was not merely in the defeat of others but in reclaiming dignity, in asserting truth, in teaching the world that a father's resolve, once ignited by betrayal and sharpened by hardship, is a force no power can suppress, no money can buy off, and no system can contain. And as the night swallowed the remnants of fear, doubt, and falsehood, I breathed deeply, feeling the storm within me settle into a hard-earned calm, knowing that justice, long denied, had finally been served, and that the legacy of endurance, courage, and unbreakable love would forever echo in the halls of memory, marking not just the survival of a man but the triumph of a father who refused to let betrayal define him.